If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, Urban Explorers, what was the creepiest or most mysterious thing you've seen or found during your exploration? My brother had a place close to an abandoned railroad depot. Then there was a box of personal items. The box had homework, personal pictures, and a release form from a teen detention center dated the previous winter. It took seconds to realize the teen was released and shipped to this town and had nowhere to go. He slept for probably a night in this place and then abandoned his only personal possessions. I found a bloody shirt, pants, shoes, and underwear in an old busted down house in the woods. When I say bloody, I mean pretty sure somebody was murdered bloody. Might be me making something out of nothing, but nonetheless creepy. There was an old brick building in the middle of my hometown. It was gutted by fire, but the walls and ceiling remained. It was some kind of grain mill. The place was huge. There was some awesome graffiti art inside. Anyway, the property was all overgrown and wooded. The place had been abandoned for decades. Whenever we went exploring there, it was mostly inside the building. We decided to explore the woods once. They were very dense and difficult to push through. We found a clearing inside. It was almost perfectly circular. There were logs arranged around the circle. A large star made of sticks was in the middle. There were figures of people made of sticks and twigs hanging from nearby branches. I have no idea what the place was, but it was the creepiest thing I've ever seen. There was an old factory about a mile from my house growing up. I explored it when I was about 13. Must have been abandoned for many years because the 2nd floor had fallen down on the 1st floor. Well, it was winter and I was walking around the 3rd floor and I found 2 really big coolers. Both of them filled to the top of rubber gloves. But these rubber gloves were actually filled with ice, so they looked like there were hands in them. They must have been filled in summer and stayed there till winter. No clue as to what or why. No water or ice in the coolers, just the full, tied-off, rubber gloves. Must have been at least 100 of them. Building was torn down less than a year later. I'm not an urban explorer or anything, but when I was around 12 to 13 I broke into a very small abandoned house near my uncle's cottage. The owner of that house was a man who had died some 20 to 25 years ago. The whole place was completely untouched, so I'm pretty sure the last persons to be there before me were the M's who locked up after they took away the body. The bed, where the guy died probably, was unmade and messy. The pillow and the blanket were half-eaten by moths. Same with the clothes hanging in the closet. Floor was covered in rat shit. There were dirty dishes in the sink which were stained yellow. On the bedroom table there was an open book and some others stacked next to it. In the drawers there was some random stuff, matchboxes, shaving kit, etc. Other than that, it seemed the guy died completely broke since there was nothing else in the house. No photos or documents, no TV or radio, no extra furniture or any other items. Doors and windows were locked, so no one else had been there. The man who died had no relatives according to my uncle and was only 45 to 50 years old. I used to explore the woods in my area and came across this creepy shed house. It seemed abandoned and run down, so I decided to take a look around. Besides the usual graffiti, rubbish, empty alcohol bottles, condoms, and homemade bongs from teenagers, there wasn't much to see until I walked into the kitchen. It was a complete wreck, but the floor was completely solid on flat ground everywhere, but in the very center of the room the floor felt weak, and when I stomped on it, it echoed, so I ripped up the flooring. It was a linoleum of sorts, and found a trapdoor, which was odd cause the flooring was almost intact. Besides the usual wear and tear, I decided to go down. At the bottom of the ladder was a short tunnel, and at the end of the tunnel, another door. I opened the door to find the most gorgeous indoor pool I've ever seen. The entire room looked like it was from some Greek heaven. The entire place looked untouched, no mess of any kind. The water was clean, there were no footprints, nothing. That place became my secret happy place, and every time I went back it was exactly the same, untouched. I once came across a small, single-story office building with one room burned down and only that room. Other rooms had various office supplies. It was weird enough that the only room that had file cabinets was the only one burned. As I went deeper into the building from the front entrance, there was an emptied room with a single chair in the middle of it with an empty gas can next to it. What happened, why and how will never be answered, and that bothers me. Not much of an urban explorer, but I've just east of LA in LA County where I was a kid, and I had cousins that lived in the hills in East LA near Soto and Marengo. I would take the bus there to hang out on the weekends, but if I caught the bus after 7 then I would have to walk about a mile to his house because the buses didn't run though his neighborhood after 7. Oh, this was back in like 1999, maybe 2000 BTW. So I missed the last bus through his neighborhood and had to walk one night. So I'm walking up by Hazard Street and this van pulls up behind me. It's a blue panel van, and they are cruising behind me slow to keep pace. I was probably 13, I'm a guy, but at 13 I already had long shoulder-length hair and I would get mistaken for a girl a lot. So as they follow I hear like 3 guys talking softly, but obviously wanting me to hear them. Hey, get in the van. We're not gonna hurt you. Come on. Come party with us. They start whistling and shit. I'm like fucking sweating bullets. I just kind of kept walking and didn't acknowledge them. They kept that pace for 4 or 5 blocks, then finally sped away when more cars started coming up the road. Legit scared the shit out of me. Not so much urban, but my dad and uncles used to take me along on hunting trips quite a bit to our regular stomping grounds in northern central PA. I was 16 and this occurrence really stuck with me. My oldest uncle was a park ranger for the surrounding area, so we had a pretty good handle on the areas we traversed and we stuck to the places we knew. We'd split up and my dad and I would push deer through and my uncles would shoot anything we pushed out. After about an hour solo my pops and I came across a cemetery in the middle of nowhere. It was spookily quiet, no animal sounds, just snow falling. All these crumbling small stone structures, some were pre-Civil War, some were Civil War soldiers. Hard to make out quite a bit of them, but it was just very out there. It'd be an hour hike from any known road and just spookily untouched. No animal tracks, no nothing. We kinda booked it out of there when my dad tried to radio over to my uncle and nothing was going through. We ended up screaming, hooting, and whistling for him and my other uncle for a good 10 minutes before we caught up. No idea what twilight zone we ended up at, but I remember my dad trying to mark it on the map via the route we took for my uncle so he could at least turn it in for preservation. I just wanted the hell out of the woods. Abandoned women's prison that's pretty much fallen apart by now. Me and some friends were walking by moonlight and occasionally our phones. We're following the path and right smack in the middle are several piles of organs from small animals. Like 6 to 7 piles, hearts, lungs, kidneys and possibly the liver. They all looked pretty fresh, they weren't decayed and they were still pretty moist. There wasn't any blood around or obvious tracks, footprints. We noped the fuck out of there with the quickness that night. I'll play the role of villain in this story. A buddy and I used to hang out in this abandoned mansion in our city, cleaning and fixing whatever fixtures were left behind. We put a lot of what into that place to make it nice, but one day a group of teenagers smashed through a glass door to come in and smoke pot. The mansion was usually pitch black in most of the rooms, but I knew the place well enough to navigate without hurting myself. These kids did not. While they're crashing and banging about in my damn project, I would follow very quietly and slide things across the floor to make noise. Eventually these kids started getting even more brazen, breaking lamps and punching holes in the wall, and one gets on the phone with a friend to set up a party. So my buddy crawls into a cabinet and starts scratching the sidewall loudly, and I zoom throughout the house making vague whispering noises. These poor explorers were getting more and more anxious until they reached the main room, at which point my friend and I let out piercing screams and chased them from the place. About 10 to 12 years ago my friends and I developed a habit of traveling this trail at night that ran next to a neighborhood. It was used by settlers and there was a historic landmark on it where you could see carvings of the people who had come through along with the year they made it, all 1800s with the exception of the jackasses who decided to make more recent additions. The trail stretches for tens of miles and follows a river, so if you want you can go very far on it. The neighborhood is offset from the trail by several hundred feet, but many of the homes overlook it and the adjacent field and river. We saw many creepy things, but there was instance that was the strangest. One evening we were about 1.5 miles into the trail, and well beyond the neighborhood. We began hearing this thumping noise. At first we chalked it up to the river running faster and creating some unusual noise as it turned through and the water ran into rocks and things. But the noise never got further or closer, even when we got near the river. The noise sounded like what you would imagine a giant taking a step would, except there were no vibrations and obviously no creatures that large. We got freaked out enough that we decided to turn back. The whole way to the car the noise never stopped and never changed in volume, as if whatever was causing the noise kept the exact same distance from us. The whole thing might not sound that scary, but hearing something that loud in the pitch black out in the middle of nowhere with no one around us scared the hell out of the 3 of us. I went urban exploring along with my friend to see some haunted abandoned motel that was never finished, even the construction signs were left behind. In the basement where he was earlier with our other friends he said there were pentagrams and other occultic signs, but we were afraid to go only as 2, because a lot of junkies were hanging out around this area. As we entered the forest in where it's located we heard some kind of whispering/singing coming from the house/trees in the forest, but not caring about this too much, but nonetheless scared to shit we went exploring the upper floors. Once we were on the first floor, for you American second floor, we heard loud bang downstairs like someone smacked the door of some cabinet, There were lots and lots of them in the main hall still left. We instantly went super quiet and could hear our own hearts pounding, and like 1 second after this noise I felt surrounded, watched and felt intense pressure and cold. Right after these feelings I heard whispers in both of my ears coming from behind me, like thousands of souls whispering into my ears madly, and at the same time my friend didn't hear anything but felt intense panic running over him. This lasted maybe like 1 second, both of us agreed to get out of there at the same time and we noped the f out of there. Also on their earlier exploring of this building without me they cleared the entire building first to get sure that nobody was there, and on his video from the basement you can hear some doors squeaking and closing themselves. Also on my video from the exploring you can hear the loud thud, and as we were noping the fuck out of there you can hear some random whisper that sounds like someone saying don't run. I was scared to death for 2 days and couldn't sleep. My college folklore professor was a very interesting woman. Once in class she told us the story of how she and her friend were working for a professor while they were in grad school in the 70s, doing research on ghost stories in a southern Indiana small town. They were tipped off to check out an old abandoned farmhouse and barn outside of town. Story was that a cowboy hung himself in the barn and you could still hear his spurs and see the marks in the wood where they dug into the support post when his feet thrashed around. So they go, don't find anything interesting in the barn, and decide to check out the farmhouse. The place is missing all the windows, the doors are hanging off hinges, and there's lots of leaf coverage and dirt in the entryway. But further into the house, it's clean. Too clean for a place left to the elements for a few decades with no windows. My professor heard her friend shriek from the back entry, followed by the cry Teresa leg. So she rushes back to see and finds what looks like an animal leg sticking out over the top of the stairs. They go up to see and find a freshly killed pig carcass, head missing and hind legs bound by barbed wire, but otherwise intact. It had been there maybe a few days. But then they see more pig carcasses, lined up heading down the hall, each one laying in the exact same position and bound by wire but in varying stages of decomp. The room at the end of the hall was missing the door and they could see the pigs go straight into the room. In the room was a circle of all the pigs' heads. There were 6 total. She said the oddest thing that struck in her mind was that she didn't remember there being a smell, despite it being early summer and there being 6 rotting carcasses. They decided it was time to get the hell out. But when they were walking back to their car, a beater truck pulled up with 2 men in it. They just stared and stared at my professor and her friend, who tried to explain why they were there and apologize. She said after several minutes, the driver said ain't no problem and gave her a really creepy smile, then backed out of the drive without ever even getting out of the truck. They relayed what they saw to their head professor when they got back into town, who then informed the local authorities. The cops took an hour to get out there, but said they didn't find anything but maybe some stains, but that the women had probably stumbled upon the local Satanists they'd been having problems with. Many years ago I was taking the train across the country to visit one of my good friends. Along the way I noticed we passed something that looked like an old abandoned freight station. But there was nothing else around, no towns, no nothing, so I don't know if this counts as urban exploration. It was reachable by car from where he lived, so when I arrived I told him about it, and we decided to go and have a look. We borrowed his parents' cars, packed some sandwiches and soft drinks and made a trip out of it. Then we drove out there, and it was really secluded. We had to do the last stretch on a gravel road. When we arrived we went in, and it looked as abandoned inside as it did outside. But down at the bottom, where there were no longer floor, but just dirt, we saw something that resembled a skeleton. At first we were a bit startled, but we went back to the car and grabbed some lights and went back in. We shined our lights, and yes, a skeleton was halfway buried in the dirt and its hands were handcuffed on its back. We didn't really know what to do or how to react. We tried to calm each other down and tell each other that it was probably fake. But we still didn't dare touch it. In the end we called the police. Since the place didn't have an official address, it took some time to get a location. The operator told us to wait until a patrol car arrived. Then about 5 minutes later I received a call from the nearest police station, informing me that a movie was planned to be filmed, and the production team had notified the police months in advance. We felt kinda silly, having nearly shat ourselves. The police did send a car, just to be sure there wasn't any bamboozle, and since it was out in nowhere, we got to sit tight for 2 hours, while feeling super stupid. The following conversation with the police is definitely one of the more embarrassing ones I've had to endure. In retrospect it doesn't really seem creepy, but in the moment, finding a handcuffed skeleton, damn that gave me chills like nothing I've ever experienced. I was exploring a large abandoned hospital complex and came across a house on the property. I assume it once belonged to the head of the hospital and his family as the complex was incredibly isolated and a self-sustaining place. We climb in through a downstairs window and the house is in fairly decent shape and mostly empty. All apart from an old baby's cradle. This thing was old. It looked Victorian, like it had been lifted off an old-fashioned pram or stroller. Very gothic looking, if I'm honest, and definitely not the kind of thing you would see anymore. We walked past and made some standard "that's creepy" comments and quickly checked out the rest of the house. There wasn't much. We have to go back through the baby cradle room to get out the window, and as we walk in I stop dead in my tracks. My friend asks what's wrong and then sees for himself. The cradle has moved several feet and is rocking. There is no breeze, and even if there was, that thing is heavy enough to have left light scratches in the wooden floor. We heard and saw no one else in the area. Still cannot explain it. There is a very large factory in Philadelphia in a bad neighborhood that had a fire, and this company decided it was time to relocate. I mean, massive building. We always went at night as we figured no sane cop would bother going in after us. Over the course of a few months my friends and I would go up to the rooftop, drink some beers or wine and work our way down, exploring as much as we could. Anything from several story tall very large rooms for equipment to office space. I actually found blueprints and was wrapping all of my gifts in them for some time. Anyway, we became very comfortable in this place. We started to get to know our way around. One of the last times I was in there we were having fun. Found some hard hats and a set of really nice mid-century chairs I was hell-bent on taking with me. We get to an area maybe 3 to 4 stories up out of 6 to 8 stories, an area we hadn't been, and we all got an ominous feeling. We all felt it at once. As we proceeded we saw an older SUV, an Isuzu Rodeo, and maybe 15 feet exactly parallel was a large, square object a bit larger. It was covered in heavy plastic sheeting. Both looked like they were just placed there. Now we all feel something weird before even getting up here. Now we see these two things 3 to 4 fucking stories up and have no clue how they got there. Bad news all around. We are all on edge. I was curious. So I approached to SUV in this object, and right in the middle of this plastic sheeting was a slit. I pushed aside this plastic and inside was a camper. I remember looking back at everyone and saying it's a fucking camper. We all look at each other and know to get the fuck out of there ASAP. As we are all running, panic sets in. I grabbed my chair. I wasn't leaving without it. My buddy is whisper yelling "you're going to get us fucking killed" as my chair is banging off of corners and hallways as I run. We start to get lost. Shit got real. I really don't think we were alone in there. I had that chair for a few years. It is a feeling I will never forget. I'm still not sure how that SUV and camper got up there. There hasn't been power there for years before, and it was literally 3 to 4 stories up. Maybe a large service elevator, but I never saw one. My only regret is not opening the door to that camper. I will forever wonder what was inside of there. When my husband and I were traveling in Moldova, I read about an abandoned Soviet military base in the woods. It was under construction when the Soviet Union fell, and so it had just been left as it was. Another group had visited it before us and taken some pretty good pictures as well, and I had to see it for myself. This base is in the middle of nowhere. I could tell from Google satellite view that there was a road in, but when we got there, it turned out to be extremely difficult to travel this road by car. It was basically 3 square concrete blocks across, but someone had removed the middle of the 3 all the way down the road, so you'd have to balance your wheels on the other 2. There were also quite a few ruts and puddles in the road, and since we had a rental car that we didn't want to damage, we just parked near the entrance to this road and walked the 1.5 kilometers or so to the base. As we headed down this road, there was a group of 4 to 5 dogs standing in our way. We yelled to scare them off. One dog seemed curious rather than threatening and ended up following us the rest of the time we were at the base, which meant several kilometers of walking. It didn't seem very healthy, and I wished we could take it home with us, but that was obviously impossible. Sadly, I didn't even have any food to offer it. As far as I'd seen, there were 3 major structures left on the base. One, just a skeleton of a building that had never been built, was easy enough to visit but not exceptionally interesting. Then there was the administrative building, which was much more complete, but when we got near this, a very large number of dogs started barking. There appeared to be at least 20 dogs hanging out around this building, and they didn't sound very friendly at all. We abandoned this attempt and headed in the other direction toward the 3rd building, which was basically underground and quite unique in appearance. Between us and the 3rd building was a pile of rubble which we began to clamber over when my husband, who is taller than me, stopped and said, "There's someone living back there." We decided not to get involved with whoever this person was and whatever they were doing, but my husband said there was kind of a wooden shack with a guy hanging around. As we walked back toward the car, still quite a way away from it, a white van with 2 guys inside came down the concrete path. I suppose they traveled it often since they didn't have any trouble staying on the concrete blocks on each side and had obviously dealt with the ruts. I was quite anxious about these guys and what they might be up to at this abandoned base in the middle of nowhere, but they didn't stop or give us any trouble. All of this was probably fairly harmless, but since I hadn't really expected to see any life at all in this abandoned Soviet base in the middle of nowhere, it felt very creepy. When I was 10, we lived in a suburb of Melbourne. Between the suburb I lived in and the next one was a 1-kilometer stretch of paddocks with a small single-lane road. Along this road was about 5 farmhouses that were all abandoned. One day a friend and I went to investigate one of these houses. This particular one we picked had trees and bushes so overgrown all around the house you wouldn't know it was there unless you knew about it when someone lived there. The original owner passed away when I was 3 and no one claimed the house. The two of us walked around the house a couple of times to see if there was an easy way in. We decides to go through a window that was broken. We climbed in and were immediately hit with a smell so foul that it would give a sewer a run for its money. It was a 2-story home. We ignored it for a while as we looked around downstairs. There was a bag on the ground that was filled with a powder. Yes, it was cocaine. We walked upstairs and came across 2 dead people and a dead dog. Both guys were in a state of decay. They had been there around 1 month. We ran to my house because it was closest and called the police. After all the hubbub, we didn't hear much for about a year. Eventually we were told that both men had been killed by having their throats slit by a third member of their group. They were squatters. The dog refused to abandon its owner and ended up dying of starvation or thirst. Police weren't very clear on that part. It really screwed up my friend. Me on the other hand, I wasn't that affected by it for some reason. I had nightmares for the first week about it, by after that I was fine. They never did find the person who killed them. They knew who it was but never found them. A friend and I were exploring a newly abandoned building in the middle of the night, but that's not where the creepiness happened unless you count a giant pentagram spray painted on the floor. It was a college town, so we didn't think much of it. Before we really got much exploring done, we heard a dog barking nearby, so we went to see if we could find it. We did. Well, sort of. The dog was wearing a collar, so we were trying to get close enough to read the owner's information. It would let us get a couple of feet away before taking off again at lightning speed. Not that abnormal, but it got weirder. At one point we had it cornered at the bottom of a set of stairs into what was essentially a walled pit behind one of the dormitories. We watched it go down the stairs. My friend followed the dog down the stairs while I stood on the top of the brick wall to watch the dog as it ran behind one of the dumpsters. When my friend reached the area where the dumpsters were, the dog wasn't there. The door to the building was locked. I had not seen it run back up the steps and had been keeping an eye on the whole area, so it's doubtful I would have missed it. Then we heard the dog howling nearby, but not from where we thought it would be. Somewhat strange, but still this could be possible, right? So we followed the howling, because at this point, it was getting a bit eerie. We didn't see the dog again for a while, but kept hearing it howling nearby. It was definitely moving. We followed it up a steep hill which led off campus into a wooded area. At this point we'd been chasing this dog for several hours, as the sun was about to come up. We were still determined, especially after a whole night of chasing this mysterious dog. And this is where it got even weirder. We reached a steep embankment as we drew closer to the howling, whose tone had become almost mournful. We wondered if the dog was sick or hurt, so we climbed up to the top. What we found up there was not what we'd expected. There was no dog. Instead, there was a very old cabin which had almost completely collapsed with all the former owner's possessions still inside. There were no other cabins around, but that in itself wasn't terribly strange so much as it was interesting. And then, beside the cabin, we discovered what remained of an old dog house, its pen knocked over and covered by pine needles. We never found the dog, and its howling stopped as soon as we reached the abandoned structure. 6 years ago, me and 2 buddies get this tip on this abandoned house 3 hours away in the middle of nowhere. We do a Google Earth search and find a way to get there avoiding attention. We get in the place and it seems like a normal abandoned house with boarded windows and all the doors except the front one that we picked the lock to get in. We see that the place isn't trashed, but there is a bunch of old furniture stacked up around the house and all of the appliances are still there but in rough shape. We explore the house further, finding dusty boxes full of books and magazines. We do searching in the boxes and the dates range from the late 70s to early 90s, nothing too out of the ordinary. Things change rather quickly when we find a box full of hardcore porn magazines. I'm not talking Playboy, but the weird BDSM fetish type shit you find in the back corner of adult stores. We dig through and find some sex toys. Since we are wearing gloves, we continue to dig through. We find mostly just cuffs, whips, various dildos and vibrators till we got to the bottom of the box where we find old photo albums in envelopes. These are all pictures of women who look to be mid-30s to barely 18 years old, all naked, bound, gauged, and several things inserted in them. Some of them looked consensual, some of them not so much. These photos look to be taken from the 80s to the early 2000s based off of the hairstyle and date stamps on the photos. Let's just say we put that stuff back and got out of there quickly. I was hitchhiking into Canada from Montana, after a trip down to Arizona. It was cold and I was headed to Alberta to work at a ski resort for the winter. Just after crossing the border, I came across an abandoned house, with an old barn. It seemed like a decent place to spend a night, where I could get out of the wind. My first stop was the house. I looked around for a bit, and recall spooking an owl in one of the front rooms. I also heard something near the back in the kitchen which I assumed was spooked by the owl. I did a full tour of the place, and came across only a few sparse things like some family photos in the kitchen alcove, where a table once stood, and some old clothing. It was pretty windy in the house except for this spot since the roof had big holes and the windows had all been smashed. So I threw down my bag by the back steps and walked towards the barn. About halfway between the barn and the house I had this eerie feeling that I ignored. I checked out the barn and spent a while climbing to the loft and snooping in places. Without a light it was hard to see, and it was not any warmer with lots of boards missing. As I exited the barn after 20 or so minutes, I was surprised that there was my bag leaning against the wall. About 60 feet from the house where I had left it. I stopped for a moment and hesitation made my heart rate rise. Then I got out my only defense, which was a larger folding knife, that I was not prepared to use, and wearily approached the house while yelling hello. I stayed a safe distance away and made my exit to the road while going around to the front of the house. As I started to walk away down the road, I looked back and felt like there was a man standing in the window by the doorway, but I couldn't be sure. I didn't wave as I really didn't want to know and just kept watch behind me as I kept walking towards the highway. I was lucky to get a ride shortly thereafter by a trucker, to whom I shared my tale, but don't think I slept much the next few days. There is an old abandoned warehouse not too far from where one of my friends live. I was visiting and we like to go to places you're not supposed to go. One night a group of people decided to skin another person alive because they didn't like him inside this building. You can still see splatters of blood on the walls. Guess they didn't feel the need to clean it up too well since it is boarded up and whatnot. The entire place feels eerie and makes you angry. Like ridiculously angry for no apparent reason. Apparently there's a ton of asbestos and other bad for you materials in there. If I find a picture on my laptop I will post it. Here is a video I was able to dig up after scouring the internet forever. This is the place. I'll place the link in description for the video, check it out if you are interested. I explored an abandoned home on an old farmstead. I took my brother and our friend with. The house was a typical turn of the century with updates, that's the turn of the 19th to 20th century. We got in the house and it was like somebody just up and left it about 1960. Hats hanging on the hat rack, keys hanging, pantry totally stocked. Fridge had black sludge where food used to exist. Every human possession you would imagine being in an old farmhouse was there. We explored every room in the house and clothes, beds, blankets, socks and drawers, old military uniform hanging in the closet still pressed and starched. Family pictures going way, way back. It was unbelievable that apparently a family could up and leave a home and all their worldly belongings like this. Furthermore that it had remained untouched for decades upon decades. It was a time capsule of an entire family's story and we treated it like a museum and didn't move or take anything. I went into the bathroom upstairs, which was strange. There were all the usual accompaniments that go with a bathroom. Soap by the sink, a men's safety razor, a lady's turtle shell brush, toothbrushes, etc. I looked left at the tub and the entire situation was evident to me suddenly. The bathtub was rotten. Like dead body rotten. Black, brown and green sludge was in the tub up to the high water mark. But not like level full, but just a malignant lining of growth. The only disturbed part of the dark rotten tub growth was a human body-sized spot going down the middle of the tub. There was also some smearing on the tub edge where I assumed the retrieving parties had slid the rotten corpse of the owner of the house. I had no way of being positive about my analysis of the rotten death tub, but my gut said a body rotted in that tub until it was nothing but mucky effluence. I left the bathroom and I had to leave the house. At that point I just had this strong desire to leave because we were disturbing something. I got out of the house and waited outside for my brother and our friend. I felt relieved standing outside. My brother and our friend came out and we decided to explore the old garage, older than dirt garage mind you. This thing was obviously built using rough-hewn lumber from a steam-powered lumber saw man. The only window inside was multi-pane, typical late 19th century. The window was a top swing type, and my brother was small enough back then to squeeze inside the old garage. He opened the garage bay door a hair and we went inside. Sitting in both bays of the garage were two pristine 1950s era Studebakers. One a pickup, with a dry rotted livestock rack bed. The other a sedan, which was a really gorgeous color of dark green to black and olive in the light. The interior of the sedan was really immaculate. It was a tan or even like a dark eggshell white with chrome accents and perfectly clean. The only items in the sedan were a lady black and garnet beaded purse in the passenger side, and in the back seat, also passenger side, a pair of elbow-length ladies' velvetish material gloves. On the shelves, in the drawers and hanging all around the two bays were old automotive tools, belts, tubing, chain hoists, and parts. The ground was dirt. We left and my brother chose to take an old spark plug box with fresh spark plug inside, circa 1950s. I felt like he shouldn't have and protested, but he was set on it, so I didn't argue with him. That old place has stuck with me as some of the best times of my youth with my brother. Years ago in England, I was looking for a new squat with some mates, so we were going into empty buildings to see if they were suitable. Generally, the older and tattier a building, the longer you can live there. We also got into exploring, so we were going into buildings that we knew we weren't going to live in just to look. One huge old Victorian building, which was fucked, had a cellar below the cellar, a sort of sub-basement. Years later I heard it connected with the Victorian tunnels under Brighton, but didn't see it at the time. The undercellar had earth floors and was only just high enough to stand up. We were in total darkness, just little torches, and we almost fell into what seemed to be an open grave. A hole, maybe 5 foot deep, by 2 by 6. Earth piled next to it. No one in it, and no reason I could see for it being there. Another time, another fucked up Victorian building, we hear scrabbling sounds from the top floor. We're a bit freaked, sounds like someone moving about, but no one replies when we call out. So I cautiously climb the stairs. Rats, fucking loads of them. They sort of piled up together in a corner and all of them were totally focused on me. And I swear the bastards started growling at me. The building had obviously once had a glass roof which has smashed long ago, and the floorboards felt like wet cardboard. I GTFO. This was in the mid-80s. My friend and I had a habit of exploring closed factories, abandoned buildings and no longer used office towers. We never stole anything, just looked around. We were in a multi-story building that was at the junction of a few highway interchanges, so that both sides of the place had elevated freeway traffic. We explore upwards, and it's the usual former office space detritus. The hum of vehicles and the passing lighting they provided was calming and welcome. Then we head downwards. We eventually find the basement, where the sounds and light from the outside world was no longer an active part of the scenery, so we pulled out our flashlights. It was full of boilers and machinery that had kept the building going back in its 30s heyday. It was a fascinating steampunk subterranean room that we hung out in for hours. Just amazing. And then we found some stairs. Going down. We crept down into the basement's basement. Low ceiling, tight confines. It must have been a crawl space for servicing access or something. Not too much down there, just really creepy. So we're checking it out and the flashlights hit a void in the cement floor way off in the corner. No way. We hunched over, make our way to the spot, and it's a hole in the floor. With yet another sub-basement below, this time with a dirt floor. So we lay down and shine our lights around, and way back on the other side we can see a shovel stuck in the ground. Next to a hole in the dirt. Out of which is a body half hanging out of said hole. So now we're 60 feet below ground staring at an apparent grave. It's not a huge drop, so we knew we could work our way out, so we drop in to check this shit out. Walk over all slow, and get close to the scene. It turns out it's a real shovel, a real grave, but a fake body. Someone had really efforted to make this subterranean sub-basement look like a burial site. Kinda laughed it off, crawled out of the dirt floor part, then out of the basement, back to the main floor. The highway was humming, the lights were bright, and the nighttime air smelled sweet as I live in Scotland and read about the legend of Sawney Bean. History says his family lived in a cave and killed those unfortunate enough who passed by unaccompanied. Once dead they would rob and then eat the bodies. This went on for over 20 years, so they acquired quite the reputation. Living not so far from the caves, I decided to visit. More out of morbid curiosity than anything else. I found the road, now a major highway, and stopped in a lay-by. It took me about 8 minutes to get to the beach, and using my cell phone, mobile in the UK, I found where the cave was. It is the most beautiful place, but C9 wholly silent, except for the waves rolling onto the beach. I walked into the cave and looked around. Everything was cool. The walls had a bit of modern graffiti, but apart from that it was a cave. Walls and wet lol. 10 minutes or so after being there I decided to leave and walked out. I left the cave but had walked about 6 foot when I heard a woman's voice. It wasn't a whisper or indistinct but a plain woman's voice from behind me. All it said was help me. I turned expecting someone to be there but saw nothing. I walked back the way I had come from, calling out and asking who it was but got no answer. I spent about 5 minutes looking and was getting ready to leave when I heard help me again coming from the cave. I walked into the cave and knew someone was watching me. I spent about 20 minutes more searching but found nothing. What I heard was real. I wasn't drinking or high and I cannot explain it, but just writing this brings it back. Wouldn't call myself much of an explorer, but there was an old medical center, not exactly sure of what town it was in, just know it was up the road, about 5 miles, from my high school, near Cedar Grove, New Jersey. The place has been demolished since then. Well, to start, I've only been there about 5 or 6 times, the friends I've gone with, probably 20 to 30 times, even at night they've gone exploring several times. The place was mostly made up of a large psych ward attached to a treatment facility and medical supply depot. The psyche ward made up most of the complex, but the medical center had several buildings, most of which were locked off. The oldest part of the complex was a clinical center that was once used as a place to treat patients with TB. Friends reported a lot of supernatural stuff from that side. Can't confirm it as I've never been to that building because don't really like being traumatized. The place had some security but most of the fences were broken in many spots and parts of the building had already collapsed, so the locked doors weren't keeping anyone out. I think that's enough of a background, so to answer your question, I guess I could explain the last trip I took there. It was in the summer around August before the senior year of high school for me, 2013 I believe. 2 friends and I had decided to go exploring in the front building at about 4 p.m. that day. While looking for an entrance we noticed a lot of desks and overturned filing cabinets in the front offices and decided to find a way to get there. After walking a bit further down and looking up, I saw much of the roof had caved in, and being the smart individual I am, decided to use that as an entrance by climbing some rubble onto the low roof. Managed to enter successfully, but the offices we had noticed before were several rooms down a hallway of patient rooms. The cave-in seemed pretty recent, which could be a reason why that unlike much of the other parts of the interior there was no graffiti in this wing. Proceeding down the hall, many of the patient rooms were locked and barred off except a few which contained thrown-off mattresses and discolored linens. Nothing was really interesting until we reached the offices. Opening the old cabinets and pulling out whatever legible files we could find was definitely a major highlight of my trips there. One thing we found did spook me though. We found old images of patients in the files. Most of them looked like mugshots, but a lot of them looked battered and bruised. The descriptions of their behavior proved even more eerie, like frequent bouts of screaming, banging head into wall, tearing up mattress, etc. We managed to leave the place out the roof without any major issues. I would have liked to explore more that day, but I am not a fan of going in there at night. It was dark enough inside as it is. I know some of you may have been expecting some kind of ghost story, but to tell you the truth, I don't have any about that place I can tell off first-hand experience. Only from what I heard and was told, which could easily be fabricated just to scare me or seem cool. Haven't found much else there besides smudged and illegible patient records, or medical journals and books. Did find an entire trailer of weird green translucent beads though. Don't know if they were for packing or what, but yeah. This was at least 8 years ago, so my memory isn't perfect, but I swear what I tell is true. I have a few photos before my camera died. This was before I had a smartphone or had any idea how to take good photos, sorry. And I'll post them when I can. Out on the edge of my hometown in Maine there was a curve in a road with 3 abandoned houses on it. 2 of them were missing parts of their walls and were in the process of being torn down. But the third was mostly intact and nestled in some trees. I went with my friends Ethan and James one day to check it out and take some photos. We parked down a nearby dirt road so nobody going by would know we were in there. The front door was slightly ajar and we definitely weren't the first to go exploring because there was some graffiti here and there. Entering the building just to our left was a light switch with a special plate with the words "Bless this house, O Lord, we pray. Make it safe by night and day," so I'm already sketched out because this place has definitely not received the blessing of the Lord. There were some stairs going up and nearby were the stairs to the basement, but we decided to explore the first floor. To the right was the living room. LPs were scattered all around and there was a diploma for a man named Richard Kunemund. Place was a mess but not too creepy. Decor was very 70s. From the living room the house had all its doors in a line all the way to the back of the house and then they were all open. So we walked back that direction. One room was pretty empty save for an old empty fridge and some vintage headphones. Frustratingly, my crappy hand-me-down digital camera ran out of power at this point. Entering the kitchen, we found the first signs that this house had some weird shit going on. First, I saw a big jar in the corner that had some sort of yellow powder in it. There was a shaft of sunlight hitting it, and I swear it was almost fluorescent. There were 2 little boxes with handles on a table in the kitchen. Upon closer inspection, we discovered they were Geiger counters. At this point, I was a little freaked out that the yellow stuff might be radioactive, but we kept searching. The wallpaper was peeling, but there were 5 or 6 papers stapled to it. They were arms dealer permits, one for each successive year. All dated in the 70s. A little workshop jutted out the back of the kitchen. It was a mess, as this part of the house was being attacked by the surrounding forest. Rubble everywhere. My friend Ethan noticed some shiny bits in the rubble. Bullet casings. We even found a few intact rounds. Think it can't get weirder? The next bit I'm not sure wasn't staged by some previous explorers/hooligans, but all the earlier stuff was bona fide real. We went upstairs, a tad nervous about the structural integrity of the floor, and found a room that was empty save for a single rocking chair in the center. In a ring around the chair, as if tossed there casually after being read, were dozens and dozens of letters, postcards, and envelopes. Among the letters was a pair of black baby shoes, lined up, facing the rocking chair. I did not enter that room. The other rooms upstairs were empty from what we could see, but the floor had some holes in it near those rooms, so we didn't go in them either. Oh, I should probably mention the poop. There was a ton of animal poop. I think raccoon. Also, a previous explorer had felt the need to excrete apparently. So, having explored most of the parts of the house that were accessible, we next decided to tackle the basement. I should mention that it is getting on about dusk at this point, and we only had one crappy flashlight between us. James decided to go down first. He had just barely gotten to the bottom of the stairs before he yelped and ran back up. His shout startled Ethan and I into yelling too. James claimed he'd heard something in the basement. I poo-pooed him and told him it was probably just a squirrel or something. So I took the flashlight and as a precaution grabbed a stick before slowly descending. Once my head was low enough to look around, I turned to my left and shined my light to find myself face to face with a goddamn badger. Okay, no, it wasn't a badger, but it was the fucking biggest raccoon I've seen in my entire life. It had its front paws stretched out and was holding onto a crossbeam. I screamed and ran back up the stairs. We had a good freak out as I exclaimed loudly about the fucking huge badger, and my friends explained that badgers don't live in Maine. Finally, Ethan decided we had to see what was in the basement and figured we probably scared the raccoon off. So we all went down again. The raccoon was nowhere to be seen. The basement was very dark and our flashlight didn't do much. It was mostly piles of rubble and junk with only one clear path leading back around to somewhere approximately underneath the living room. We shined the flashlight over the rubble, and there, about 10 or 12 feet away, was what looked like a stone well, tilted at about a 20-degree angle towards us. But our flashlight didn't do much to illuminate it, and we couldn't see how far down it went. Nor could we easily get closer. At this point, the freakiness of the whole evening was starting to wear on us, so we booked it out of there. I'll try and find what little stuff I have about that trip and post photos and stuff. Any questions, just ask.